Have you ever wondered what a single locked door could cost someone, or what it might give back? The winter Evelyn Marsh turned 43 was the winter everything she had built over 2 decades quietly fell apart. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part, it never does. It started with the phone call in October, the one where her accountant, a careful man named Douglas Hale, said the words "insolvency proceedings" in the same flat tone he might use to describe the weather. Her small landscaping company, the one she had started with a second-hand truck and a borrowed seed spreader, had been bleeding money for 8 months. A bad contract. A client who vanished, a competitor who underbid her by so much she later found out he'd been cutting corners on pesticide disposal. By November, the trucks were gone. By December, so was the office lease. And by the first week of January, the particular January that concerns us here, Evelyn was living out of a storage unit she had secretly rented in the name of her company before it was dissolved, sleeping on a camping cot between boxes of invoices that no longer meant anything to anyone. She was 43 years old, and she had nowhere to go. She had a daughter in Vancouver, Simone, but that relationship had its own cracks, ones that had been forming for years before the bankruptcy made everything worse. Her parents were gone. Her ex-husband had moved to Halifax long before the business collapsed, and whatever warmth they'd salvaged after the divorce had cooled into the polite silence of 2 people who wished each other well from a distance. Her friends, the ones she had made through the business, through networking events and industry dinners, had a way of becoming unavailable the moment there was nothing left to network about. So in the second week of January, with minus 23 degrees pressing against the thin walls of her storage unit, and the small electric heater she'd bought at a Canadian Tire, beginning to smell like burning plastic, Evelyn packed 1 bag, got into the only vehicle she still owned, a 2009 Subaru with a cracked rear light and 1 winter tire that was dangerously close to bald, and drove north. She didn't have a destination, she had a direction. She'd heard vaguely, years ago, that her mother's sister, her Aunt Cecile, had owned a piece of land somewhere outside of Parry Sound. Cecile had died in 2019, and Evelyn had not attended the funeral. She wasn't proud of that. There had been a falling out, the details of which had faded into the general blur of her 40s, and by the time Evelyn heard Cecile had passed, it felt too late to do anything except feel guilty. She didn't know if the land had been sold, developed, or absorbed into some other estate. She didn't even know exactly where it was, but she had a last name. Cecile had married a man named Aldous Van Torp, and she had the name of the town because her mother had mentioned it once at Christmas, in passing, in the way that certain pieces of information get dropped and lodged somewhere in the brain and never fully retrieved until they're suddenly the only thing left. Parry Sound, Cecile Van Torp. That was all she had. She drove through the night. The highway north of Barrie narrowed, and the snow that had been decorative in the city became something else entirely. Thick, directional, sweeping across the road in low horizontal sheets that her wipers couldn't quite keep up with. Evelyn pulled off twice, once to fill the tank and eat a granola bar in a gas station parking lot, and once because a transport truck had jackknifed ahead, and traffic was stopped for 40 minutes while the tow trucks sorted it out. She sat in the dark with the engine running and watched the snow and thought about how strange it was to be this age and this lost. She reached Parry Sound just before 7 in the morning, at a diner that opened early, the kind with laminate tables and coffee that came in a white ceramic mug before you even asked. Evelyn ordered breakfast and sat across from a woman named Ruth Calloway, a municipal clerk who was apparently a regular at the Tuesday morning table by the window. Evelyn hadn't meant to talk to anyone, but Ruth had the unhurried generosity that some small-town people carry like a second coat, and within 20 minutes Evelyn had explained in edited form why she was there. Looking for land that might have belonged to a Cecile Van Torp, might still belong to the estate. Ruth didn't know Cecile, but she knew the Van Torp name. There had been a property, yes, out past the old mill road, toward the lake. Aldous had died first, 2015 or 2016, she thought, and after Cecile passed, the property had gone through probate slowly because there were no immediate heirs, and the estate lawyer had been thorough to the point of being unhurried. As far as Ruth knew, it hadn't sold. She wrote down directions on a napkin. Old school, pencil, 3 turns and a landmark. Evelyn left a larger tip than she could afford and drove out to find it. The road wasn't a road exactly by the time it reached where the property began. It was more of an interruption in the trees, 2 ruts in the ground that the snow had filled in almost completely, recognizable only because the brush on either side grew in a corridor shape, a narrow parting that suggested something had once passed through regularly. Evelyn parked where the ruts began and walked. The cold was immediate and specific. Not the blunt cold of a city in January, which carries the faint residual warmth of exhaust and concrete and 1,000 bodies in close proximity. This was the cold of open country and frozen water, and the kind of silence that only exists when everything that makes noise has decided to wait out the winter somewhere deeper in the earth. Her boots punched through a thin crust of ice with each step. Her breath came out in clouds. She found the house. Calling it a cottage seemed too cheerful. Set back from the tree line at the edge of a clearing that sloped gently toward the lake. It was a low-built thing, 1 story, with a loft visible through the upper window, clad in board and batten siding that had once been painted dark green and was now mostly grey. The roof sagged at one end, the door was padlocked, but it was standing, and that, in the particular calculus of Evelyn's situation, was enough. She didn't break in. She walked around the perimeter twice, noting the window latches, the state of the foundation, the stovepipe emerging from the roof. Then she sat down on a snow-covered porch step and thought for a long time. She was trespassing, technically. But the estate had no living heirs she was aware of, and she was, however distantly, related to the woman who had once owned this place. More importantly, she had no alternative. The second time she walked around the house, she found that one of the basement windows had been left unlatched. Whether by time or oversight, she couldn't know, and she lowered herself in. The inside was cold in the particular way of a house that has been empty for a long time. Not just the absence of heat, but the presence of something damp and still and waiting. There were furniture shapes under canvas tarps, a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a hand pump still attached to the sink. On the wall, a series of watercolor paintings of the lake, amateur but careful, the kind a person paints when they love a place too much to photograph it. Evelyn stood in the middle of the main room for a long time, and then she started a fire. She spent 3 days in the house before she touched anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. She found firewood stacked under a tarp at the side of the house. She melted snow for water. She ate what she'd brought in her bag. And she thought, clearly, for the first time in months, because that is what cold and silence and necessity will do to a person who has been running on adrenaline and dread. They slow you down until you're forced to see the shape of things. On the 4th day, she began looking around. Not out of curiosity, exactly. More out of the practical necessity of understanding what she was in. There were boxes in the loft, canvas bags, a wardrobe with a broken mirror on the door, and behind the fireplace. She found it because she was trying to remove a bit of loose mortar that was letting cold air in. There was a shelf built into the wall, deep enough to be invisible unless you knew to look for it, sealed behind a panel of the same stone as the rest of the surround. She would have missed it entirely, except that the mortar wasn't loose because of age. It was loose because someone had removed and replaced it deliberately, many times, over many years. The gasps were worn smooth. She pried the panel open with a flathead screwdriver she'd found in the kitchen drawer. Inside was a tin box, the old kind, green with a floral motif, the kind that had once held shortbread and been repurposed for whatever needed keeping. Inside the tin, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white and was now the color of old paper, was a bundle of documents, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this and deserves to. Evelyn sat down on the stone hearth and read. The letter was from Cecile, written in her late 60s, based on the date. The handwriting was large and deliberate, the kind that comes from someone who spent their childhood copying letters on lined paper before the world started typing everything. It was not a warm letter. Cecile had not been, by any account Evelyn had gathered in her childhood, a warm woman. She was practical, she was observant, and she had, it emerged over the next 4 pages, spent most of her adult life watching her late husband's business partner systematically dismantle everything Aldous had built. His name was Gordon Presley. He was 81 years old and he lived, still, in a lakefront house outside of town that he had purchased with money that, according to Cecile's letter and according to the documents bundled inside the tin, had never been entirely his. The Van Presley partnership had built 4 commercial properties in the Parry Sound area between 1987 and 1998. Aldous had kept meticulous records, the way men of his generation often did. Ledgers, receipts, signed agreements, correspondence. What the documents showed was a slow and careful pattern. Expenses inflated on Aldous's side of the ledger, profits routed through a numbered company that Presley controlled, signatures on agreements that had been backdated. Aldous had noticed toward the end, Cecile wrote, he had gone to a lawyer, and then his health had failed, quickly, in the way that stress and betrayal sometimes accelerates what age has already started, and he had died before anything was done. Cecile had kept the documents. She had carried them through 15 years of her own widowhood, unsure what to do, too old to fight, too angry to destroy them. So she had left them, for whoever found them, and she had added, at the bottom of the letter, a single paragraph that Evelyn read 3 times. I don't know who you are or how you came to be in this house. But if you've come this far, you probably need something. These papers are worth something. Use them or don't. I no longer have the energy to care about Gordon Presley, but I cared about Aldous, and he deserved better than what he got. Evelyn sat very still for a very long time. Then she wrapped the documents back in their cloth, put them in her bag, and began to think. She was not a lawyer. She was a bankrupt landscaper who had spent the last month sleeping on a cot. She had no money, no contacts in the legal world, and no particular reason to believe that documents from a tin box behind a fireplace would amount to anything other than an old woman's unresolved grief. She was also painfully aware that she was not the intended beneficiary of anything in that house. She was a trespasser with a familial connection tenuous enough to be legally meaningless. But she was also 43 years old, and she had spent 2 decades building things from nothing. She knew how to assess a situation. She knew what due diligence looked like. And she knew with the particular clarity of someone who has hit the bottom and is looking up, that the documents in that tin were not nothing. She drove back to town. At the public library in Parry Sound, Evelyn spent 4 hours on the computer. She found the land registry records. She found the corporate filings. She found a 2003 news article about Gordon Presley being celebrated at a local business awards dinner, photographed with his hand on the shoulder of a man named Philip Strand, a local real estate lawyer, who was still, apparently, practicing. She thought about going to Strand. Then, she thought better of it. A lawyer who had been photographed warmly with Presley in 2003 was not necessarily a lawyer who would look at documents incriminating Presley in 2026 and feel moved to act against him. She needed someone different. Ruth Calloway, the woman from the diner, had mentioned, in the way that people in small towns mention things obliquely, as part of a longer story about something else, that there was a woman at the Conservation Authority office who had been trying for 2 years to get someone to look at some irregularities in the deeds on a parcel of land near the lake. Her name was Harriet Boone. Evelyn found her. Harriet Boone was 66, small, and possessed of the particular energy of someone who has been angry about something for a very long time and has learned to compress that anger into a kind of focused, efficient force. She worked in a cluttered office in a building that smelled like old carpet and lake water. When Evelyn knocked on her open door and said she had documents that might relate to some land irregularities in the area, Harriet looked up from her desk with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has almost stopped expecting it. She examined the documents for 2 days. Then she called her nephew, a man named Marcus Webb, who practiced civil litigation in North Bay. Marcus was 34, deliberate, and not the kind of person who made promises he couldn't keep. He told Evelyn, after reading the documents himself, that what she had was not a guarantee. 15-year-old documents from a tin box would face challenges. Chain of custody. Authentication. The question of whether the statute of limitations applied to various portions of the claim. But the pattern they showed was consistent, and the corporate filings Evelyn had found at the library corroborated key elements. He was willing to pursue it on contingency. Contingency meaning I don't pay unless you win, Evelyn said. Contingency meaning neither of us does, Marcus said. She nodded. Then let's find out. What followed was not quick, and it was not clean, and it was not the kind of thing that resolves itself in a single dramatic confrontation. It took 9 months. There were depositions. There were counterfilings. Gordon Presley's lawyer, a man from a firm in Barry, expensive and unhurried, submitted 3 motions to have the evidence excluded. All 3 were denied. There was a moment in June when Marcus called Evelyn and told her that Presley had made an offer to settle, quietly, for an amount that was not insignificant but was also not, in Marcus's professional estimation, reflective of the full extent of what the documents showed. Evelyn thought about it for exactly 1 night. She called Marcus in the morning and told him no. The settlement that was ultimately reached. In October, in a conference room in North Bay that smelled like recycled air and other people's negotiations, was significantly larger than the June offer. It was structured as a recovery of assets from the original Vanthorpe-Presley partnership, with additional damages for the delay. The estate of Cecile Vanthorpe, which Evelyn had petitioned to be recognized as a rightful beneficiary of, given her familial connection and her role in surfacing the documents, received the primary distribution. Evelyn's portion, as the person who had found the documents and initiated the process, was formalized through an arrangement that Marcus had negotiated carefully, and that Evelyn understood to mean she would not be sleeping on a cot again anytime soon. Gordon Presley did not go to prison. The civil settlement was not a criminal conviction. Evelyn had asked Marcus about this early in the process, and he had been honest with her. Civil fraud is not the same as criminal fraud, and the standard of proof is different. And Presley was 81 with a competent lawyer. What happened was that he paid. He sold the lakefront house. He moved, according to the one article that covered the settlement in the local paper, to an apartment in Barry. Evelyn went back to the house outside of town in November. She had spent part of the intervening months, on weekends and in the gaps between legal proceedings, quietly fixing things. The roof, the window latches, the kitchen. She had paid for the materials herself, a slow investment in something she hadn't yet fully decided to claim but couldn't quite stop returning to. When the estate was settled and her portion came through, she made it official. She bought the property from the estate at a fair market value that she paid herself, no discount sought. It was hers, not because she'd found something, not because she'd taken something that wasn't, but because she had done the work, legal, physical, and otherwise, that Cecile had, in her own exhausted way, been hoping someone would eventually do. On the first day she spent in the house as its legal owner, Evelyn built a fire and sat in front of it for a long time without doing anything else. The watercolor paintings of the lake were still on the wall. She'd cleaned the glass on each of them carefully with a cloth. In the early evening light, they were actually quite good. She called Simone. It was a short call, the first real one in almost 2 years. It didn't resolve anything. Those things never do, not in a single call, but it was a beginning. And Evelyn was old enough to know that beginnings are sometimes all you get to hold on to until you've done more of the work. In the spring, she started a new company. Not landscaping. She'd put that particular version of herself to rest. Property restoration. Historic buildings, mostly. the kind that needed someone willing to understand what they'd been before deciding what they should become. She had, it turned out, a useful combination of skills. The physical knowledge of someone who had spent 20 years working outdoors, the financial caution of someone who had lost everything once, and the particular patience that comes from spending a winter alone in a house that nobody wanted and finding out, slowly, that it had been worth the cold. She hired 2 people by June. Harriet's nephew Marcus sent her a client who had an old mill property outside of Huntsville and didn't know what to do with it. Ruth Calloway mentioned her to someone at the municipality who was trying to find someone to assess a heritage building near the waterfront. Things moved slowly in the north. Then all at once, what Evelyn didn't tell many people, what she mentioned only once, to Harriet, over coffee in Harriet's cluttered office, was that she had almost turned around. Somewhere outside of Barry, in the early hours of that January morning, with the snow coming across the road in sheets, and the transport truck jackknifed ahead, and 40 minutes of stillness in the dark, she had thought seriously about driving back, about calling the storage unit company and seeing if she could get another month, about doing the smaller, safer, more obvious thing. She hadn't, not for any grand reason. Mostly because she was tired, and the only thing she wasn't tired of yet was moving forward. That's usually how it works, Harriet said. Evelyn thought about Cecile, a woman she had last seen at a family gathering in 1998, who had seemed to Evelyn then like someone who disapproved of most things, including Evelyn herself. A woman who had kept documents in a tin box for 15 years and addressed her letter to nobody, because she didn't know who would come, who might not have believed anyone would. She left something anyway. That is the thing Evelyn thinks about now, in the house by the lake on winter mornings, when the cold is the same kind of cold as that first night, and the fire takes a minute to catch, and everything is still and possible. Cecile had left something for a stranger, had trusted, without evidence, without a name, without any reason except the stubbornness of someone who refused to let an injustice disappear entirely, that someone would come. What would you have done with those documents? Left them there? Taken them and walked away? Evelyn took them and stayed. That's the whole story. And it made every difference. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. We'd love to know what moved you most. And if you believe that every abandoned place holds something worth finding, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to claim the drama, because the next story is already waiting.